Hello, my name is Casey, and I'm in a new location than my other videos. I know I don't have that many videos, but I'm in a new location, and that is because I moved to a different city. But I'm not gonna dox myself, so city is unnamed. Oh, yeah, he loves to be in the way. And now I have a cat. I got my first ever commission this year. I have been asked by friends to alter clothing before, but I have never been asked to create something completely from scratch. Not only did I get my first ever commission from scratch, but they asked me to make a video about it explaining my process because they want to know what goes into sewing an entire outfit from scratch. So that's what this is. I'm very excited. I don't know if you can tell. It was very fun to make these, but very stressful. There's lots of things that I've learned, which I will talk about later in the video. There's lots of things I could have done differently, lots of things that I'm proud of, but without further ado, let me show you the designs and explain what I did.
The costumes I was creating were a gender-bent version of the triple Baka squad to be worn at Otakon. For anyone who isn't familiar with these characters, they are a set of 3 Vocaloids who made a silly song together where they basically call each other stupid. The 3 Vocaloids are named Neru, Miku, and Teto. I was tasked to create 3 costumes for a trio of friends who each have a signature color that aligns with the color of one of the Vocaloids. Here are the designs we came up with. Instead of skirts, they wanted to wear dress pants. Instead of wigs, they wanted to wear scarves around their neck. But overall, I tried to add as many little details that the original characters had into these new designs.
We had some issues at the start in finding supplies for the costumes. We tried to go to thrift stores to find various fabrics, but I was very particular with what type of fabric, and then they were very particular with the color of the fabric. So we were trying to find things that were kind of perfect, but it was proving to be a little bit difficult. We kept finding mustard colors, but they wanted like a pure yellow, and we kept finding t-shirt material, but I did not want to use t-shirt material because it's too stretchy and doesn't do what I want it to do. Like, it doesn't look good, in my opinion, with the dress pants and the dress shirt and then having like a t-shirt material for the accents. I wanted a thicker material for that, so something like cotton or something thicker. I just did not want anything stretchy. And then I wanted something sheer or something kind of scarf like, something light for the scarf part, but we were also having trouble with that. So we got a little bit close to the deadline when we were still trying to find materials, so I kind of had to cram all of the sewing into the last month before the con. And even then, we were still trying to find things. I had to order more lace a week before the deadline because I ran out of lace and it did not come in time, so there were just things that we had to kind of accept and be okay with, unfortunately. Now onto the steps. Now what I did with the fabric once I had all the materials.
I started by seam ripping pretty much everything we got from the thrift store. I wanted to have just flat pieces of fabric to work with. Seam ripping is no joke, by the way. I had all my fingers engaged and my hands were so sore afterward. We got this shirt at the thrift store and I thought the ruffles already attached to the shirt were really cute, but we didn't end up using that for Miku's ruffles. The buttons were perfect though, so we did use those. Next, I got started on the arms. Most Vocaloids have these cute armbands, and we wanted to recreate that, so we thrifted 3 pairs of pants and used the legs as the armbands. I measured each of the 3 pairs of pants' circumference and wrote the measurements down. I then matched up the circumference of the bottom of the pants to each cosplayer's bicep size. Since the armbands needed to be flared, it mattered which pants I gave to each person. I then started working on Miku's accent fabric. I took the length from the circumference of the hem at the bottom of the pants and marked that on these blue jeans we thrifted. Sorry to any sewists out there who are watching me mark on the good side of the fabric. I apologize. I just felt like it. And I know you all see my chalk right there, but it was not showing up on this fabric because both of the colors were too light, so I did use a pencil. Once again, I'm sorry. I then measured the width of the hem at the bottom of the pants, and then I marked that width onto the blue jeans, as well as adding some seam allowance. This is also the point where I realized I definitely needed one of those flat, heavy rulers so that I could make straight lines. So I ordered one, but that too did not come on time. It's okay though, I'll use it for my future projects. I finished marking it and cut it out and decided to iron it because it was a little bit wrinkly. I ironed everything throughout this whole project just to make sure everything looked crisp and nice. I took the first piece that I cut out and laid it on top of the rest of the pants to make a second one, because of course I have to make 4, one for the top of the left armband, bottom of the left, top of the right, and bottom of the right. I pinned it down to make sure everything was aligned, cut it out, and then made 2 more after this. I ironed and pinned down the seam allowance to make sure everything stayed smooth. Also, you can see my assistant in these clips monitoring my progress. Her name is Whoopi. I repeated this process on all 4 colorful strips, and I made sure to measure to make sure that they were an even width all the way down. Then I set those aside to work on later. The characters all wear sleeveless collared shirts, so I got to work chopping off all the sleeves of these collared shirts. Right as I finished removing the second sleeve of this shirt, I got this message. I, in fact, had already started chopping off the sleeves, but I will always hear my client out. Apparently, Neru and Teto did not want sleeveless shirts. They wanted full sleeves, and they wanted their armbands to be attached to the collared shirt's sleeves. Luckily, I hadn't started on Teto's yet, so that one was still intact. However, Neru's, I did have to reattach the sleeve, which caused a whole host of other issues later on. But no worries, it's nothing I couldn't handle, and I want to make sure my client is 100% satisfied with these cosplays. I decided to set that shirt aside and go back to working on the armbands. I previously measured all 3 of the cosplayers' dimensions, so how long their arms were, how wide their arms were, etc. However, a lot of this process did end up having to be eyeballing since I didn't have access to them trying on the clothes at every stage. I measured the length of the pant leg and marked it where the cosplayer wanted it to hit, as well as leaving some room for seam allowance. I was lucky that the bottom of the pants were already hemmed, so I could just add the colored layer on top of that. Once again, I forgot to measure and mark everything on the bad side, so I had to switch it all inside out and then remeasure and mark everything. There was this weird lining layer inside the dress pants, which I just cut out to make it lighter. Then I repeated all of these steps for the second armband. Once I was done with those, I set the excess fabric from the pants aside and went back to working on the shirt. Now it was time to reattach the sleeves. It's a little bit difficult to sew something rounded, so what I did was pinned half of it and then tried to sew in as straight a line as possible. And then I pinned the other half and finished up the circle. Repeat that for the other sleeve, and then it's all done. Next, it was time to figure out how wide I wanted the armbands to be. I obviously had the measurements of all of their circumference of their biceps, but that's of course super tight, and I wanted to make sure that the shirts wouldn't feel too tight on their bicep if I made the measurement exact. That being said, I also didn't want it to be too loose because then the armbands would slip off or hang weird. So this part I kind of had to fiddle around and eyeball it. I was trying to figure out how many inches to take off of the armband to make sure it was just right. Also, unfortunately, due to me having to reattach the sleeves, I now did not have an accurate measurement of where the wrist would hit on Neru's cosplayer. What I ended up doing was adding a couple centimeters to the length of the armband to offset the centimeters lost in reattaching the sleeve. I then measured the width of the sleeve where I thought the bicep would have been and used that measurement to make the armband instead of the bicep measurement that I had. I also only measured half of the sleeve and then just doubled that in order to make the full circumference of the armband. The armbands took a lot of math, so I'm going to do my best to try to explain my process. First, I measured the entire width of the top of the pant leg. Then I divided that by 2 and found the exact middle of the pant leg. So to complicate things, that's about 1/4 of the entire circumference of the top of the pant leg. After marking the exact center of the pant leg, I then took the width of the shirt sleeve and divided that by 2 as well. I marked half of the width on either side of the middle marking. The reason I did all this is because I didn't want it to look lopsided or straight on one side and then diagonal on the other side. I wanted it to be equally diagonal on either side. I trimmed a little off the top so I wouldn't have a massive hem. I then had to turn it inside out and do all my markings all over again. Please do not ask me why I do this every single time. I have no idea, but I do. At least I'm using chalk this time, so small wins. Okay, we're gonna sew it. Let's hope it turns out good because I'm a little bit freehanding it. I sewed it with a basting stitch with a white bobbin thread. For those who are not sewers and don't know what that means, a bobbin is the below thread, so the top thread is what goes in the needle, and the bobbin is what the needle basically makes a knot with. And a basting stitch is basically just a very wide stitch that is easy to take out if you make a mistake. On my machine, there's very few settings, so I just use the biggest stitch, which is setting 4. And the reason I used a white bobbin is because if I did want to take it out, a black thread is so hard to see on a black fabric, so I wanted to use something with high contrast so that I could actually see the stitches that I'm trying to pull. I finished my test on both sides, now let's see how it turned out. I was happy with the results, so I went over it with a tighter stitch to make sure that nothing came undone. Then I did my favorite part, which is cutting off the excess. I flipped it inside out and decided I was happy with the results, so I went ahead and made the second one. I did all those same steps and completed Miku's armbands as well. I also watched a lot of Daria during this entire process. I then double checked the length for all 4 armbands, that way I could figure out where to hem the top hem. I pinned and sewed that down, and then I started working on the colorful bands. I already had them measured and pinned from earlier, so I just had to sew straight lines down the sides. Since Miku's armbands were not going to be attached to a shirt, I had to sew a piece of Velcro to ensure that the armbands stayed attached to the arms. Here are some drawing recreations explaining what I did. First, I cut a slit in the top of the armband. Then I folded the 2 flaps over, creating a triangular opening. I sewed those flaps down and then sewed a small piece of Velcro to either side of the opening. I am a massive hater of anything that claims that it's iron-on because in my experience, iron-on stuff falls off immediately, so I had to hand sew the Velcro on, which was very difficult. However, it was also very secure, so in my opinion, it was worth it. I then pinned the completed colorful strips to the bottom and the top of the armbands. I then sewed those down, ensuring that they laid as flat as possible. I then completed all of the same steps for Neru's armbands. I measured the width of the pant hem to figure out how wide I needed to make the colorful strip. It came out to about 1.5 inches. I was interrupted by another visit from my assistant. This yellow fabric I had for Neru ended up being a lot thinner and a lot more see-through than the fabric I had for Miku, so I had the idea to cut out 2 strips per band. That way I could put 2 strips together so they wouldn't be see-through. So what that means is instead of having 4 strips, I cut out 8 strips of yellow fabric. Then I hemmed each of the 8 strips. Then I paired them up, layered them bad side to bad side, and sewed those down as well. I folded the strips over, pinned them to the sleeve, and sewed them down. I tried on the Miku sleeve, and I kind of think it looks like a horse hoof. I could probably make a My Little Pony cosplay if I wanted to. Now that Miku and Neru's armbands were done, I decided to get started on Miku's hair/scarf. Despite seam ripping majority of the shirt, the sleeves were still in my way, so I decided to just cut them off. I cut the remainder of the shirt in half horizontally, so I had 2 very long strips. Then I ironed all of it down because it was super wrinkly. There were also some darts I forgot to seam rip, so I took those out as well, so I had a flat, smooth surface to work with. I folded the first one in half, good side to good side, and sewed that down as a test. I ironed it flat and thought it turned out really well, so I did my best to recreate it for the second strip. I wasn't too happy with the random seams in the middle, but there wasn't much I could do about that without losing length, so I decided that it's probably just not noticeable from a distance. I did accidentally mess up when cutting the second strip. I accidentally cut a rounded chunk out of the middle, so I had to do a lot of pinning and repinning to get it to lie straight. Eventually, though, I was satisfied with how I pinned it, so I sewed it down. I sewed each bottom into a rounded point to resemble Miku's pigtails. I then cut off the excess. I then had to use various objects to try to push it right side out. I used my hands, my scissors, a pencil, and eventually got it. Sharp corners are always an issue. You can see how wrinkly it gets from this process, but don't worry, I ironed it all nice and flat. I then tucked one half inside the other, pinned it, and sewed it down. I then had one long continuous Miku scarf, which can be fashioned into pigtails. Here I am, styling different ways to wear it. Ooh, so fashionable and long. Pretend you don't see those seams. With Miku's scarf done, I decided to hem Miku's sleeves. I cut little snippets out of the outer portion of the sleeve. I then folded each chunk down and pinned it. I've found that chunking it this way and sewing each chunk individually has led to less wrinkling and bunching of a sleeve. Or any rounded attachment really, it doesn't have to be a sleeve. I then sewed this down as flat as possible. I personally think the sleeves turned out really well. I'm very proud of them. I trimmed off each little chunk and then I was all done. Look how nice and smooth that turned out. As I was moving on to the next portion, a series of unfortunate events occurred. The bobbin jammed as I was trying to sew another piece, and instead of looking in the guidebook for how to unjam a bobbin, I decided to take off every piece that I could from the sewing machine. Eventually, I actually read the guidebook and realized it was an incredibly easy fix. I didn't even have to take the plate off. And then when I was bending down to screw something into place, this happened. I just spilled an entire cup of water over with my butt. My socks and butt are fully soggy, so that's pretty awesome. So I spent the entire rest of the day very soggy, because why would I change my pants? I have work to do. Here is the underside of my machine. This is where the problem actually was, and now you can see why it was so stupid that I was taking apart the entire top of my machine. However, it did kind of work out for me because under here was a massive pile of lint so thick that it was encrusted onto the metal plating, so I had to scrape it off with the screwdriver. So maybe it's kind of a good thing that I started taking things apart, because I never would have taken that off and taken all that lint out. But now, look how fresh and so clean. Except it still looks very dirty, but there's nothing I can do about that. But I did get rid of all the lint, so yum. Here I am putting back all the little pieces that make up the casing that protects and surrounds the bobbin. Despite having had this machine for over 10 years at this point, I'm still learning new things about how it works, so I'm glad I know how to take apart the bobbin casing for the future. Next, I got to work making a mock-up of ruffles for the sleeves. I knew my client wanted ruffles on all of the sleeves and collars of the shirts, but I wasn't exactly sure what that meant. I ended up making these little rounded bubble type things. I tried pinning them in different ways, but I really just thought they were so ugly. My client then explained that he wanted the color of the ruffles to match the color of the character, so we ended up looking for some cute lace to add instead. While we were waiting for the lace to come, I decided to get started on Naru's hair/scarf. I ironed out the wrinkles and basically measured half of what I did for Miku's scarf. I cut that out and got to pinning. You want to know what's kind of funny to me? Is that the other yellow fabric I bought had some sort of smudge on one of the sides. And she was like, hey, there's a smudge on this. Do you want it discounted, or do you want me to cut you a new piece? And I, of course, said discounted, because I'm not even going to be using the whole yellow, which I didn't. I still have quite a lot left. And I don't know where the smudge is. I honestly didn't even notice it, so I was like, of course, discounted, thank you. But anyway, she offered to discount that one, but this one literally had writing on it, which I did notice, and I was like, what is this writing? Why is there like Sharpie on it? But I guess since it's on the bad side, she didn't mention it, and I guess she was like, oh, it's on the bad side, so you're not going to be able to see it anyway. And I guess the smudge on the other yellow was on the good side. I was just surprised that she didn't say anything about this one. I'm supposed to be leaving on vacation like today. And my girlfriend's literally waiting downstairs for me to tell her when I'm ready to go. But I'm so stressed about these costumes. I just want to like keep working, but I also want to go on vacation, and I feel like I'm missing out on my vacation a little bit. But it'll be okay, because we still have multiple days. If we head down today, I also have an essay due today. Ugh, Jesus. Spoiler alert, a massive storm delayed their trip even further. We had to stop in a hotel for the night, and I finished my essay there because a massive storm was flooding the roads. But don't worry, concerned viewer, I got it done and I got an A. Eventually we made it, and I got to work on the square panels for Neru's pants. I was working by the backyard pool of the house we were staying at, and this is the view. It was very pretty, and even though it stormed the whole time, we still had a lot of fun. I didn't have my iron, so I couldn't make everything completely smooth, but I did my best to mark 4-inch by 5-inch panels. That was the only thing I really was able to complete on vacation, but then we headed back. I sewed down all the sides on each of the rectangles. I then measured and pinned them onto the pants where I wanted them, ensuring that they were even. I then hand sewed them down. Next, it was time to sew Neru's bands to the shirt sleeve. Like I said before, we lost a couple centimeters when sewing the sleeves back to the shirt, so I put the armband a couple centimeters below where I thought it should be and then hand sewed it on. The lace finally came for all of the costumes, and I got to work sewing those down to the collars and sleeves. The collars were too thick to put a pin through, so I did my best to hold the lace in place while I sewed in a straight line. Anytime I would get to a corner, I would cut a small snip in the corner of the lace and then fold it over and hand sew the corner down. I would then sew a straight line until I got to another corner where I would then repeat the process. Once I reached the other end, I would hand hem it and then cut off the excess. I then would repeat the same process for Neru's shirt. I used the same steps as before to make Tedo's armbands as well. And then my bobbin ran out.
All right, we're gonna have to refill a bobbin. Are you guys excited? I'm gonna show you how I refill a bobbin. You come to the back. This is what moves the needle, and this little circle inside, you loosen that. I can't do it with one hand though. So you loosen this circle inside, so now it's like wiggly, okay? Then you take the end of your string, wrap it around the bobbin a couple times, and then I think it goes down like this. And then it's supposed to latch on. There we go. Hold that there. Make sure this isn't tangled because that will ruin everything. I'm messing up, but it's okay. And then we put that there. And I sometimes like to hold the string anyway because I feel like sometimes it gets a little messed up, but then you just put your foot on the pedal. Whoa. And that's why I like to hold the string. And I'm gonna hold it this time. And that is the sound of my band coming off. There we go. There we go. The bobbin is full. It automatically goes off like that. Then we just cut the string, just deattach these two, and then we put the bobbin back in its case. Now we have a black bobbin. This is what my chalk looks like.
At this point, I took a break from sewing to try to test some things on my own hair. One of the cosplayers had asked me if there was any way he could do his hair like Tedo, but I didn't know, so I said I would test it out on my own hair. I don't own a curling wand. I only have a flat iron that I use for wigs, so I was trying to see what I could do without curling my hair. But absolutely nothing I tried worked, and I'm pretty sure I just ended up burning my hair. I tried like 6 different methods, but literally nothing worked, so I ended up telling him that I just didn't know what he could do other than putting his hair in pigtails. I did get one singular, tiny, nice curl out of this, so I guess that's good. After this terrible hair fail, I was worried that my idea for Tedo's neck scarf wouldn't work, so I decided to get started on that ASAP. I cut a couple strips, pinned them down, sewed them, and turned them inside out the same way I did the other 2 scarves. I set those strips aside. I then grabbed some wire that I had and tested sliding it into the cloth strips I had made. The bottom of the wire was too sharp and poked through the fabric, so I took a small square of excess fabric and sewed it onto the bottom of the wire to create a blunt, soft tip. After I had a blunt tip made, I slid the strips back onto the wire. I sewed the bottom of the strip to the fabric cluster at the bottom of the wire. I cut off the excess fabric from the top and then slowly sewed the fabric to the wire, starting at the bottom and working my way up. I repeated this process and had 2 red wire pigtails. This is what it looked like sewed down to the wire. I then had to create the collar portion of the scarf. I stretched out the remaining wire I had and measured it to ensure it would be long enough to go around Tedo's neck. I cut a piece of fabric slightly longer than the wire and pinned and sewed that. Then I slid the wire through and followed the same process of sewing it down against the wire. Then I used pliers to round the edges so that it wouldn't stab the cosplayer. I hemmed the edges and hand-sewed Velcro to each side. At this point, it was a couple of days from the con and we needed to have a try-on day. The cosplayers came by and tried everything I had prepared on. I marked where I wanted Tedo's armbands to sit. We realized that Miku's armbands were slightly too tight. Then tragically, we realized that Neru's shirt just did not fit right at all. I initially thought it was the armbands that were causing the issue, but it was actually the shoulder area causing the issue. It was too tight around the shoulders because of reattaching the sleeves. The armbands were at a good height, so I cut the gray sleeves off underneath them, not only so the costume would be cooler to wear, but also so I had extra gray fabric to be able to alter the sizing of the shoulder area. I unfortunately do not have footage of this process, but I ended up cutting a straight line up from the armband to the shoulder hem and did my best to add a large triangle of fabric there to hopefully open up the shoulder area a bit more. I did get feedback that it still wasn't sized perfectly on one side, which was disappointing, but hopefully we'll be able to fix that in the future. I also added an inch of blue fabric to the top of each of Miku's armbands and reattached the Velcro. I then made all of the strips for Tedo's armbands out of a pair of red jeans we thrifted. We decided to go for more of a bright red color than a pinkish red because it was easier to find and because the cosplayer's signature color was a brighter red than Tedo's signature color. I pinned all the accent strips down and sewed them into place. Now I am measuring the length and width of the button strip so that I can add a red accent over top of it. Then I take the red accent fabric and measure the length and width of that as well. I mark it and then snip snip, I chop it where I marked it. I tend to always cut it at least a few inches larger than what I need because just in case there's any mistakes in calculations, it's better to be safe than sorry. I also didn't feel like seam ripping another pair of jeans because jeans are hard to seam rip, so I just cut along the seam and used the flattest piece. I was really eyeballing a lot of the cutting and making it way bigger than I needed so then I could just fold it down to size. But then when it came to measuring to pin everything, I was really meticulous and I was measuring the width every half inch. Creating straight lines is the most important thing. I sewed each side of the strip down. Actually sewing things together is the shortest part by a long shot. Measuring everything and making sure everything fits together takes so long out of the sewing process. I then laid out the shirt and pinned the red strip to the button strip. I don't have a machine that can make buttonholes and I genuinely did not have enough time to try to do it by hand, so I just left it as a solid strip. It is still able to be buttoned, I just wasn't able to make it look like it could be buttoned. I also don't know if the strip would have made it too thick to be buttoned even if I did cut out the buttonholes. Regardless, I actually really like how it looks as a solid strip. Anyway, I sewed that whole strip down. I then sewed the red lace onto Tedo's collar the same way I sewed the other two. I also had to widen Tedo's armbands by about 1.5 inches each. Then it was time to pin the armbands into place. I pinned them where I had previously marked with my chalk. I hand sewed those into place and then tried it on just for fun. I cut off the interior shirt sleeves to reduce weight and heat. I then attached these cute buttons I found at the fabric store. Okay, so I sewed it onto the neck piece, but they stick out sideways really goofy, so I'm adding a strip right now to try and make it hang. I hope that'll work. I try to sew very tiny stitches on the front so that they'll be almost invisible, though you can see little depressions in the fabric, but it's not noticeable from far away, I hope, so I think it's pretty good. Also, in the background of the first part of this clip, you can hear my brother trying to convince my mom to get another dog. I tried them on again and they turned out much straighter than the first time. I honestly think this is my favorite part of the entire 3 costumes that I made. It's so fun, the curls are so bouncy. Next, I had to add about 1 inch of length to the collar portion so that it would fit around the cosplayer's neck. I seam ripped the Velcro and took it off and then added a small piece of the accent fabric, which was jean, so it was thicker. That way the collar would still be thick and strong. The reason I used the jean fabric was because I did not have any more wire. I added about 1 inch of the accent fabric and then reattached the Velcro. By this point, majority of the costumes were complete, so it was time to finish up all the smaller details. Vocaloids all have these numbers painted onto their arms. Since Neru and Tedo were not going to have any skin showing on their arms, we decided to have the numbers be sewn onto the shirt sleeve instead. Miku decided he would just paint his directly on his arms since his shirt was sleeveless. I started by measuring how much space I had on each sleeve. I then looked up a reference of each Vocaloid and drew the numbers out. I knew I had to draw the numbers in reverse in order to hem them, and I did that for most of the numbers, but for some reason I forgot to reverse the number 1, so I had to remake that one. I carefully hemmed all the little numbers and then pinned them into place, adjusting them so they lined up nicely. It was hard to tell if they were straight without having someone wearing the shirt, but I think it worked out. I hand sewed the numbers into place. We also once again went with the bright red fabric rather than the pinker red the Vocaloids have, just because the red fabric was what was available. Then I replaced all the gray buttons with the blue buttons on Miku's shirt. I also added the keyboard to Neru's armband. I initially started sewing the keys on, but they felt so flimsy and eventually ripped right off, so I decided to hot glue them instead, which seemed to hold much better.
This belt is too small to go around the hips of the Miku costume. This is super robotic. So I attached a clip right here so that it can be a belt chain instead. And I poked a hole in the other end so that we could attach it to both sides so it can go on the belt loops like this.
And finally, I replaced all the shoelaces with ones of coordinating colors.